Boston, March 18, 1990. 1:24 in the morning. A buzzer sounds at the side entrance of a 4-story Venetian palace that sits in the Fenway neighborhood. 2 men in police uniforms stand at the door, their breath visible in the cold March air. Behind them, a red Dodge Daytona sits parked on Palace Road, engine still running. Inside, a 23-year-old security guard named Rick Abath looks at the video monitor. He sees 2 Boston police officers. They tell him they're responding to a disturbance. It's St. Patrick's Day weekend. The streets are full of people celebrating. A disturbance doesn't seem unusual. Abath does something he isn't supposed to do. He buzzes them in. 81 minutes later, those 2 men walk out with 13 works of art. Paintings by Rembrandt, a rare Vermeer. Works by Degas and Manet. Together, they're worth more than $500 million. It's the largest property theft in American history. And 35 years later, not a single piece has been recovered. This isn't a story about a perfect crime. The thieves cut some paintings from their frames with all the care of someone opening a box with a steak knife. They left behind more valuable works. They spent over an hour inside the museum, making 2 trips to their car. They didn't wear gloves. They should have been caught. But they weren't. This is the story of the Gardner Museum heist. It's a story about 2 men who walked into one of America's most extraordinary museums and walked out with masterpieces that haven't been seen since. It's about the woman who built that museum and filled it with treasures she'd spent a lifetime collecting. It's about organized crime in Boston, about mobsters and murder, about suspects who keep dying before anyone can charge them. It's about empty frames that still hang on museum walls, waiting for paintings that may never come home. Chapter 1. Isabella's Dream. To understand what was stolen that night in 1990, you need to understand where it came from. You need to understand Isabella Stewart Gardner. She was born in New York City on April 14, 1840. Her father made his money importing Irish linen and making smart investments. The Stewart family had wealth, but Isabella wanted more than comfort. She wanted culture, she wanted art, she wanted to build something that would last. In 1860, just before her 20th birthday, Isabella married John Lowell Gardner, Jr. Everyone called him Jack. He came from one of Boston's oldest and most prominent families. The Gardners had been in Massachusetts since before the Revolution. They had money and status and connections that opened doors. Isabella and Jack moved to Boston after their wedding. Her father gave them a house on Beacon Street as a gift. For a while, life seemed ordinary for a wealthy young couple in the 1860s. But then, tragedy struck. Their son, Jackie, died of pneumonia. He wasn't even 2 years old. Isabella suffered a miscarriage after that. The losses sent her into a depression so deep that her doctor recommended travel as treatment. So they traveled. And travel changed everything. Isabella and Jack went to Northern Europe and Russia. They toured Egypt and the Middle East. They explored Asia. Isabella kept detailed journals of everywhere they went, everything they saw. She developed a love for art and architecture that would define the rest of her life. In 1884, Isabella visited Venice for the first time and stayed at the Palazzo Barbaro, a beautiful Venetian palace owned by some friends from Boston. The Palazzo was a gathering place for artists and writers. John Singer Sargent painted there. Henry James visited. Isabella fell in love with the space, with how art and architecture and daily life could blend together into something extraordinary. She started collecting art seriously in 1881. At first, it was rare books and manuscripts, then paintings. She met Bernard Berenson in 1886. He was a brilliant Harvard student studying Renaissance art. Isabella and some friends helped fund his studies abroad. Berenson became an expert on Italian Renaissance painting, and he became Isabella's chief advisor on art purchases. With his help, she bought Botticellis and Titians and Raphaels. She competed with other collectors, including some who were buying for Boston's Museum of Fine Arts. Isabella had an eye. She knew what she wanted. She understood quality. She bought a self-portrait by Rembrandt in 1896. She purchased one of only 34 known paintings by Johannes Vermeer. She collected Asian art when most Americans dismissed it. She bought works by contemporary artists like James McNeill Whistler and John Singer Sargent, who became close friends. By the late 1890s, Isabella and Jack had accumulated so much art that their house on Beacon Street couldn't hold it all, even after they'd expanded it once. They started planning a museum, a place where they could display their collection properly, a place designed specifically for the art they'd gathered from around the world. Then, Jack died suddenly in December 1898. Stroke. He was 61 years old. He never saw the museum they dreamed of building together. Isabella could have stopped. She could have sold the collection or donated it to an existing museum. She didn't. She pushed forward. She bought land in the Fenway, which was then a marshy, undeveloped area on the edge of the city. She hired an architect named Willard T. Sears, but she was so involved in every decision that Sears joked he was just the engineer making Isabella's vision real. The building took 3 years to construct. Isabella modeled it after 15th-century Venetian palaces. 4 stories surrounding a central courtyard covered in glass. The first floor would have a music room. The second and third floors would be galleries. The fourth floor would be her private apartment. She traveled to Europe to find architectural elements for the building. Roman columns, Byzantine capitals, Gothic doorways, Renaissance windows. She brought them all back and incorporated them into the design. Somehow, it all worked together. The museum felt cohesive despite pulling from so many different periods and styles. Once construction finished in 1901, Isabella spent an entire year installing her collection. She didn't hire professional museum staff to do it. She did it herself. She decided where every painting would hang, where every sculpture would sit, how every textile would be displayed. She mixed periods and cultures. She put furniture next to paintings next to decorative objects in combinations that felt intimate and personal rather than academic and distant. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum opened on January 1, 1903, with a private celebration. Members of the Boston Symphony Orchestra performed. The menu included champagne and donuts. A few months later, it opened to the public. Isabella had one very specific demand in her will. The museum could never change. Not the art, not the arrangement, nothing. If anything was permanently altered, if any piece was moved or removed, the entire collection would be sold and the money would go to Harvard University. She wanted her vision preserved exactly as she'd created it. For nearly 20 years after the museum opened, Isabella lived on the 4th floor and continued refining the galleries below. She hosted concerts and exhibitions. She supported young artists and musicians. She became known as one of the most important cultural figures in Boston. They called her the Queen of the Back Bay. Isabella suffered a stroke in 1919. She had others after that. She continued welcoming visitors to her museum until she died on July 17, 1924. She was 84 years old. She'd created something remarkable. A museum that felt like a home. A collection that reflected one woman's extraordinary taste and vision. And because of the terms of her will, that collection stayed exactly as she'd arranged it. Nothing added, nothing removed, nothing moved. Until March 18, 1990. Chapter 2. Boston in 1990. To understand the Gardner Heist, you need to understand Boston in 1990. You need to understand what the city looked like, what was happening in the streets, who controlled what. Boston in 1990 wasn't the clean, expensive, tech company-filled city you see today. The city was grittier then, rougher around the edges. Crime was higher. Organized crime still had real power. The New England Mafia, part of the larger Patriarcha crime family, controlled significant chunks of Boston's illegal economy. They ran gambling operations, loan sharking, drug distribution. They had connections to legitimate businesses that served as fronts. They had politicians and police officers on their payroll. They weren't invisible. By 1990, though, things were changing. Federal authorities had been hammering organized crime for years. RICO laws, wiretaps, informants turning state's evidence. The old structures were cracking. That created chaos. Internal fights over who'd take control. Violence between different factions. Several key figures in Boston's criminal world were in prison in 1990, or fighting federal charges. Vincent Ferrara, a powerful capo in the Patriarcha family, was awaiting trial on racketeering. Others were serving time on various convictions. This created opportunities for mid-level criminals to make moves, to try schemes they might not have attempted when the hierarchy was more stable. The art world in 1990 was also changing. The 80s had seen massive inflation in art prices. Japanese collectors were paying record amounts for Impressionist and modern paintings. The art market had become huge business, with billions of dollars changing hands at auction houses and private sales. But where there's legitimate money, there's usually an illegal market too. Stolen art had become a significant part of international crime by 1990. Authorities estimated the trade in stolen art was worth between $1 and $2 billion per year. Stolen paintings could be used as collateral in drug deals or arms transactions. They could be held for ransom. They could be sold on the black market to wealthy collectors who didn't care about provenance. Art theft wasn't unusual in Boston in 1990. In fact, the city had a history of it. A man named Miles Connor had been stealing art in New England since the 1960s. Connor was famous for it. He'd stolen a Rembrandt from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts in the 70s. He'd helped to return it later to avoid prison time on other charges. Connor was in jail in March 1990, but he'd proven that Boston's cultural institutions were vulnerable. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum knew it was vulnerable. In 1988, 2 years before the heist, an independent consultant reviewed the museum's security. The consultant said security was about average for museums at the time but recommended improvements. The security director at the Museum of Fine Arts also suggested upgrades. The Gardner's Board of Trustees didn't approve the improvements. The museum was in financial strain. They were paying their security guards just slightly above minimum wage. They couldn't afford major security overhauls. Besides, Isabella's will prohibited major renovations to the building. Making significant changes to security systems would have been complicated. The museum's security flaws weren't secret. The guards knew about them. Some of the guards talked about them outside work. In retrospect, the museum was a sitting duck. A relatively small staff, limited security measures, priceless art. The Fenway neighborhood where the museum sits was quieter in 1990 than it is today. Fewer late-night businesses, fewer people on the streets after dark. On a Sunday morning at 1:30, it would have been especially quiet. Most people would be home, sleeping off St. Patrick's Day celebrations. March 18, 1990. Was the Sunday after St. Patrick's Day. Boston loves St. Patrick's Day. Huge parades, bars packed all day and night, people wearing green, drinking, celebrating Irish heritage and also just celebrating. By midnight on the 17th, going into the 18th, most of the city was either drunk, exhausted, or both. 2 men in police uniforms standing outside a museum at 1:30 in the morning wouldn't have seemed strange. Boston cops working overtime on a holiday weekend made sense. If anyone saw them, they'd think nothing of it. Chapter 3. The Night Guards. Rick Abath was 23 years old in March 1990. He was a musician, a drummer, loved the Grateful Dead and other jam bands. He'd dropped out of Berklee College of Music. He was playing in bands around Boston and working the night shift at the Gardner Museum to pay bills. The job wasn't demanding. One guard would patrol the galleries with a flashlight and walkie-talkie. The other would sit at the security desk. They'd switch partway through the shift. They'd check rooms, make sure nothing was disturbed, watch the monitors. On most nights, nothing happened. Abath had been working at the Gardner for a while. By March 1990, he knew the routine. He knew the building. He was comfortable there. The other guard on duty that night was Randy Heston. He was 25. March 18th was his first time working the night shift. He was less experienced, less familiar with the procedures. Abath and Heston started their shift the evening of the 17th. St. Patrick's Day celebrations were still going strong outside. Inside the museum, everything was quiet. Around 12:30 in the morning, some people leaving a St. Patrick's Day party near the museum noticed a car parked on Palace Road near the museum's side entrance. Two men in police uniforms were sitting inside. The witnesses didn't think much of it. Cops were everywhere on St. Patrick's Day weekend. Inside the museum, Abath was doing his rounds. Around 1 in the morning, fire alarms started going off in several rooms. Abath checked for smoke or fire. Nothing. He went back to the security room where the fire alarm control panel showed alerts in multiple locations. He figured it was a malfunction. He disabled the panel and went back to his patrol. Before finishing his rounds, Abath stopped at the side entrance of the museum. He opened the door briefly, then closed it again. He didn't tell Heston he'd done this. Later, investigators would wonder if this was a signal to someone outside. Abath said he routinely opened and closed the door to make sure it was locked. But one of his colleagues told reporters that if Abath had been doing that regularly, supervisors would have noticed it on their computer printouts and stopped him. Abath got back to the security desk around 1 in the morning. Heston took over patrol duties. At 1:20, the two men in police uniforms got out of their car and walked to the side entrance of the museum. At 1:24, they rang the buzzer. Chapter 4. 81 minutes. Abath saw two Boston police officers on the video monitor. They said they were responding to a disturbance. St. Patrick's Day weekend. Drunk people probably causing problems somewhere nearby. Made sense. Museum policy was clear. Guards weren't supposed to admit anyone except other guards and museum staff. No exceptions. But these were police officers. They said there was a disturbance. Abath buzzed them in. The two men walked through the entrance. One was taller, one was shorter. Both wore authentic-looking Boston police uniforms. The shorter one looked at Abath and said something that would have sounded perfectly normal coming from a cop. "Don't I know you? You look like someone who has an outstanding arrest warrant." The shorter man asked Abath to step away from the security desk and show some identification. This was brilliant for two reasons. First, it got Abath away from the security desk, which had the museum's only panic button. Second, it gave the thieves control through a perfectly plausible police interaction. Abath stepped out from behind the desk. The shorter man told him to raise his hands and turn around. Abath complied. The man handcuffed him. Around this time, Heston walked back into the security room. The taller thief immediately turned Heston toward the wall and handcuffed him too. With both guards handcuffed, the thieves dropped the pretense. One of them said, "Gentlemen, this is a robbery." They wrapped duct tape around the guards' heads and eyes, leaving just a small opening so they could breathe. They led both guards down to the basement without asking for directions. This suggested they knew the museum's layout. In the basement, the thieves handcuffed Abath to some equipment in one room and Heston to a pipe in another. They looked through the guards' wallets, presumably to find their addresses. They told the guards that if they cooperated and didn't inform authorities later, they'd receive a reward in about a year. That if they didn't cooperate, the thieves knew where they lived. It had taken less than 15 minutes to subdue both guards. By 1:35, the thieves had complete control of the museum. Then they went to work. The museum had motion detectors throughout. They recorded the thieves' movements. The two men went directly to the second-floor Dutch room. 6 of the 13 stolen pieces came from that room. They took Rembrandt's Christ in the Storm on the Sea of Galilee. It's Rembrandt's only seascape. The thieves didn't remove it from its frame. They cut it out. They cut it roughly, with no concern for preserving the edges or protecting the canvas. They took another Rembrandt from the same room, A Lady and Gentleman in Black, cut from its frame. They took a small self-portrait etching by Rembrandt. This one they actually removed from its frame properly. They took Vermeer's The Concert. Only about 34 paintings by Vermeer are known to exist. The Concert is considered one of the most valuable unrecovered paintings in the world. Some estimates put its value at over $200 million. The thieves took it from its frame. They took a painting by Govert Flinck called Landscape with an Obelisk. At the time, it was attributed to Rembrandt, though that attribution was later disputed. They removed it from its frame. They took an ancient Chinese bronze vessel called a gu, or beaker, from a table in the Dutch room. From the short gallery on the second floor, the thieves took 5 drawings by Edgar Degas. They also took a bronze eagle finial that had topped a Napoleonic flag. Then something odd happened. The motion detectors recorded the thieves going down to the first floor and entering the blue room. But the motion detectors showed no movement in that room during the time the thieves were in the museum. The only footsteps recorded in the blue room that night were Abath's, during his patrol rounds before the robbery began. Yet something was stolen from the blue room. Manet's Chez Tortoni, a small painting of a man in a top hat sitting in a Paris cafe. The thieves left its frame behind. Here's the strange part. Security consultants reviewed the motion detector equipment several weeks after the theft. The detectors were working correctly, so either the detectors somehow missed the thieves' movements in that room, or someone else took the Manet before the robbery began. The thieves spent 81 minutes inside the museum. That's a long time for a robbery. They weren't rushing. They made 2 separate trips to their car to load the artworks. They walked through the galleries selecting specific pieces, while 2 guards were tied up in the basement. Before leaving, the thieves removed the videotape from the security recorder. It had captured their images at the side door and possibly elsewhere. They took it with them. At 2:45 in the morning, the 2 men walked out of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum with 13 works of art. They got in their car and drove away. The guards stayed handcuffed in the basement for hours. Police finally arrived at 8:15 that morning, more than 6 hours after the thieves had left. By then, the artworks were long gone. Chapter 5. The Morning After. The day shift arrived at the museum Sunday morning to find no one at the security desk. They called police. When officers arrived, they found Abath and Heston still handcuffed and duct-taped in the basement. As officers walked through the galleries, they saw immediately what had happened. Empty frames, slashed canvases still hanging on walls, missing sculptures. The Dutch room looked violated. The spaces where paintings had hung showed cleaner rectangles on the wall, protected from decades of dust and light exposure. Museum director Anne Hawley had only been in the job since 1989. She'd been director for barely a year when her phone rang that Sunday morning with news of the theft. She rushed to the museum. The scene must have been devastating. Holly knew Isabella Gardner's will. The collection was supposed to remain unchanged forever. Now 13 pieces were gone. Masterpieces. Works that Isabella had personally selected and placed with such care. Investigators arrived quickly. FBI, Boston police. The scope of the crime was immediately apparent. This wasn't some smash and grab by amateurs. The thieves had spent over an hour inside. They'd known which rooms to target. They'd taken specific valuable pieces, but they'd also done some puzzling things. They'd left behind Titian's The Rape of Europa, which was the single most valuable painting in the museum's collection. It hung right there in the same building. Worth more than anything they'd taken. They ignored it entirely. The pieces they did take were spread across 3 different galleries on 2 floors. This wasn't about grabbing whatever was easiest to reach. They had targets. However, the way they'd removed the paintings suggested they weren't art experts. They'd cut some canvases from frames roughly, without concern for damaging the edges. This would significantly reduce the value of the works. Any knowledgeable art thief would have known that. Museum officials wondered if the thieves were working from a shopping list provided by someone else, maybe a private collector who wanted specific pieces. That would explain why they took certain works and ignored others. It would explain why they spent so much time inside but didn't necessarily handle the art with care. 3 days after the heist, on March 21st, the museum announced a $1 million reward for information leading to the safe return of the stolen artworks. That reward would eventually grow to $10 million, the largest reward ever offered by a private institution for stolen property. The FBI immediately assigned agents to the case. At one point, they had around 30 agents working on it. They started with the obvious suspects, guards who might have had inside knowledge, known art thieves in the Boston area, organized crime figures who might have the connections to fence stolen art. They quickly focused on Rick Abath. He'd let the thieves in. He'd violated protocol. There was the question of him opening the side door shortly before the robbery. And there was the Monet stolen from the Blue Room, where only Abath's footsteps had been recorded. The FBI monitored Abath's bank accounts for years, looking for any sign he'd profited from the heist. They watched for suspicious deposits. They interviewed him repeatedly. Abath always maintained he had nothing to do with the robbery. He cooperated with investigators. He took polygraph tests. But the FBI never fully eliminated him as a suspect. Abath never went back to work at the Gardner Museum. He moved away from Boston eventually, settled in Vermont, tried to move on with his life. But the suspicion followed him. Every time the anniversary of the heist came around, reporters would find him. Documentaries would feature him. People would wonder if the hippie drummer who'd buzzed in 2 fake cops had actually been in on the whole thing. In 2015, Abath told NPR, "Even if they get the paintings back, they'll never be the same, and I feel horrible about that. I don't want to be remembered for this alone. I'd like to be remembered for the good things I've done. I'm a husband, a father of 2 really cool kids, but they're saying it's $500 million worth of artwork, and ultimately I'm the one who made the decision to buzz them in." Rick Abath died in February 2024 at the age of 57 after a long illness. He never stopped insisting he wasn't involved. He never stopped living under suspicion. Chapter 6. The Suspects. Within months of the heist, investigators started hearing names. Boston's criminal underworld talked. Informants talked. People who'd heard things, who knew things, who'd been asked to help with various aspects of the crime. One name that came up early was Miles Connor. Connor was a legendary art thief in New England. He'd stolen from museums before. He knew how to case a job. He understood the art market. But Connor had a solid alibi for March 18, 1990. He was in prison, serving time on federal drug charges. Still, Connor had connections. He knew people who might have pulled off the Gardner job. Years later, Connor would claim his friend Bobby Donati was involved in the heist. Bobby Donati was a mid-level criminal in Boston, connected to the New England Mafia. He'd been in and out of jail for robbery and other crimes. According to Connor, Donati had once been caught carrying 2 Boston police uniforms, the same type of uniforms the Gardner thieves wore. Connor told investigators that Donati had organized the heist to use the stolen art as leverage. Connor was in prison. Donati wanted to arrange for Connor's release by offering to return the paintings in exchange for commuting Connor's sentence. It was a scheme Donati supposedly thought would work because it had worked before. Connor himself had negotiated his way out of trouble years earlier by helping return a stolen Rembrandt to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. But if Donati was involved in the Gardner heist, he never got to use it as leverage. In September 1991, 18 months after the robbery, Donati was attacked outside his home in Revere, Massachusetts. He was stabbed repeatedly. His throat was slashed. His body was found several days later in the trunk of his Cadillac, parked about a mile from his house. Donati's murder was never solved. Some thought it was related to mafia politics. There was a power struggle happening in the New England crime family at the time. Donati was close to a faction that was losing. Maybe he was killed for that reason, but maybe he was killed for the Gardner paintings. Another name that came up was Carmelo Merlino. Merlino ran an auto body shop in Dorchester called TRC Auto Electric. It was supposedly a legitimate business, but authorities believed it was a front for organized crime activity. In the early 1990s, informants told the FBI that Merlino was bragging about the Gardner heist. He said he was going to recover the artwork and collect the reward. He had connections. He could broker the return of the paintings. But Merlino never produced any paintings. In 1999, he got caught in an FBI sting operation. He and some associates were trying to rob an armored car depot. Federal prosecutors offered Merlino a deal. Reduced sentence if he could help return the Gardner artwork. Merlino couldn't do it. He died in prison in 2005 from complications related to diabetes. 2 associates of Merlino kept coming up in the investigation: George Reisfelder and Leonard DiMusio. Both men fit the general physical descriptions of the thieves. Both had criminal backgrounds. Both had connections to Merlino's operation. George Reisfelder had spent 16 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. He'd been wrongfully convicted. His lawyer during the appeal was John Kerry, who later became a U.S. Senator and Secretary of State. Reisfelder was finally cleared in 1982 when the actual accomplice in the killing gave a deathbed confession naming someone else. Reisfelder got out of prison with a lot of anger about what the system had done to him. He went back to crime. By 1990, he was involved with Merlino's crew. After the Gardner heist, Reisfelder's sister-in-law claimed she'd visited his apartment and seen a painting on his wall that looked like Manet's Chez Tortoni, a man in a top hat sitting at a cafe. She said it looked real. But the painting was never recovered, so there's no way to know if what she saw was actually the stolen Manet or a copy. Reisfelder died in September 1991 from what was ruled a cocaine overdose. He died in his apartment. Some investigators have questioned whether it was really an accidental overdose or whether someone killed him. Leonard DiMusio had been involved in home invasions and other crimes. He was known for being methodical and slow. One person who knew him said he drove 25 miles an hour on the expressway. This would explain why the thieves spent 81 minutes inside the museum. DiMuzio wasn't someone who rushed. Reisfelder's sister-in-law said something interesting about DiMuzio. She said the thieves kept going down to the basement during the robbery to check on the guards, asking if they were comfortable, if they needed water, if the duct tape was too tight. She said that sounded exactly like something DiMuzio would do. He'd served time in prison. He knew what it was like to be treated badly. He wouldn't want to hurt the guards. DiMuzio disappeared about 2 weeks after Reisfelder's death. His body was found in June 1991 in the trunk of a car in East Boston. He'd been shot to death. Another murder connected to the heist. In 2013, the FBI announced publicly that they'd identified the two thieves with a high degree of confidence. In 2015, they named Reisfelder and DiMuzio as their primary suspects. Both men resembled the police sketches. Both were connected to Merlino. Both died within a year of the heist. But neither man was ever charged. Both were dead, and none of the artwork was ever recovered. There were other suspects over the years. David Turner, another associate of Merlino's, was investigated extensively. The FBI believed he might have been one of the thieves or might have had knowledge of where the paintings went. Turner denied any involvement. He was convicted of other crimes but never charged with the Gardner heist. Robert Bobby Guarente was another name that came up. Guarente was connected to both Donati and Merlino. Informants said he might have ended up with some of the paintings after the heist. He died in 2004, also without ever being charged. Robert Gentile, an elderly mobster in Connecticut, became a key suspect years after the heist. A search of his property in 2012 turned up a list of the stolen Gardner paintings and their estimated values. Gentile was arrested on weapons charges. Prosecutors offered him deals if he'd cooperate on the Gardner case. Gentile always insisted he knew nothing about the paintings. He went to prison on the weapons charges and was released in 2019. He died in 2021, still maintaining his innocence. There was also a strange episode with a journalist in 1997. A man named William Youngworth claimed he could arrange the return of the paintings. He picked up Boston Herald reporter Tom Mashberg late one night and drove him to a warehouse in Brooklyn. Inside, Youngworth showed Mashberg what appeared to be the storm on the Sea of Galilee. Mashberg saw it by flashlight. He noticed cracking on the canvas and cut edges that matched the museum's reports. He saw Rembrandt's signature on the ship's rudder. Mashberg wrote about the experience, but the painting was never produced. Youngworth's story fell apart. It's unclear whether what Mashberg saw was actually the stolen Rembrandt or an elaborate hoax. What's clear is that everyone connected to the heist started dying. Donati murdered in 1991. Reisfelder died in 1991. DiMuzio murdered in 1991. Another man named James Marks, who'd claimed to have access to some of the paintings, was shot to death outside his home in Lynn in early 1991. Merlino died in prison in 2005. Guarente died in 2004. Gentile died in 2021. Retired FBI agent Jeffrey Kelly, who led the investigation for over 20 years, said all those deaths within 18 months of the heist had a chilling effect on the investigation. People who might have known something were scared to talk. People who might have been involved were dead. Kelly's theory, developed over decades of investigation, is this: Merlino organized the heist, possibly on behalf of someone else. He sent Reisfelder and DiMuzio into the museum dressed as police officers. The initial plan was probably just to steal some Rembrandts and make quick money. But once they got inside, they realized they could take more. They spent 81 minutes cherry-picking masterpieces. Then they woke up on March 19th and realized they'd committed the heist of the century. Paintings worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The art world in shock. FBI agents everywhere. It was too big. Kelly thinks both Reisfelder and DiMusio were killed either for the paintings themselves or to keep them quiet. Merlino couldn't produce the paintings when prosecutors offered him deals because he no longer had them. They'd moved through various hands, maybe ending up with Guarente, maybe going somewhere else entirely. The FBI believes the paintings initially went to Connecticut and possibly to the Philadelphia area. They think organized crime networks moved them around, possibly trying to sell them on the black market. There have been reported sightings over the years. Someone claimed to have seen one of the paintings in Ireland. Another report placed them in Japan. Others suggested Saudi Arabia or South America. But 35 years later, not a single piece has been recovered. Not one confirmed sighting. Not one reliable lead that brought investigators to actual stolen artwork. Chapter 7. The Empty Frames. In 1994, 4 years after the heist, the Gardner Museum made a decision. They put the empty frames back on the walls where the stolen paintings had hung. This wasn't the obvious choice. The museum could have removed the frames entirely. They could have hung other works in those spaces. They could have tried to fill the gaps and move forward. Instead, they chose to keep the wounds visible, to remind everyone what was lost, to create a kind of memorial to the stolen art. Walk into the Dutch room today, and you'll see those empty frames. The gilded edges that once surrounded Rembrandt's only seascape now surround nothing. The frame that held Vermeer's The Concert is empty. 5 spots on the wall where Degas drawings hung showed just blank space. It's haunting. Museum visitors stop and stare at the empty frames. They take pictures. They talk in quiet voices about what was stolen. The frames have become almost as famous as the paintings that once filled them. The museum says the frames are there as symbols of hope. They're waiting for the paintings to return. Someday, the museum hopes someone will provide information that leads to recovery. Those frames will be filled again. Isabella Gardner's vision will be restored. But 35 years is a long time to wait, a long time to hope. The museum still offers a $10 million reward for information leading to the recovery of all 13 works in good condition. They'll pay a portion of that reward for information about individual pieces. There's also a separate $100,000 reward specifically for the return of the Napoleonic eagle finial. The FBI still considers the case active. Agents still follow leads. The museum's director of security, Anthony Amore, has been investigating the heist since 2005. He works with the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office. They're still looking. But the reality is that most of the people who likely had first-hand knowledge of the crime are dead. Reisfelder and DiMusio, if they were the thieves, died in 1991. Merlino died in 2005. Donati, if he was involved, died in 1991. Guarente died in 2004. Gentile died in 2021. Rick Abath, who let the thieves in, maintained his innocence until he died in 2024. Even if he had been involved somehow, that knowledge died with him. Art theft experts say that stolen masterpieces often don't resurface for generations. Sometimes they're found decades later in an attic or storage unit. Sometimes a relative of a criminal discovers them after the criminal dies and realizes what they have. Sometimes they're recovered when police raid a location for unrelated reasons and stumble onto the art. The Gardner paintings might be in a vault somewhere, waiting. They might have been destroyed, though that seems unlikely given their value. They might have been moved around so many times by different criminal networks that whoever has them now doesn't even know how to safely return them or sell them. There's also the possibility that the paintings have been damaged. They were cut from frames, roughly. They've been stored improperly for over 3 decades. Old master paintings need specific temperature and humidity conditions. They need professional conservation. The Gardner Museum has begged whoever holds the paintings to at least store them properly to prevent further damage, but without knowing where they are, there's nothing anyone can do. Chapter 8. The Legacy. The Gardner Museum heist changed how museums think about security. In the 35 years since that March morning, museums across America have upgraded their systems. Better cameras, more guards, stricter protocols about who gets admitted and when. Panic buttons that actually work. The heist also highlighted the vulnerability of small and medium-sized museums. The big institutions like the Metropolitan Museum of Art or the National Gallery have massive security budgets and extensive staff. Places like the Gardner, with extraordinary collections but limited resources, are softer targets. Insurance companies changed their policies after Gardner. Many museums that previously had theft insurance found their premiums skyrocketing, or their coverage dropped entirely. The Gardner Museum itself didn't have theft insurance at the time of the robbery. The cost was too high. After the heist, getting insurance would have been nearly impossible. The case has fascinated people for over 3 decades. There have been books written about it, documentaries, podcasts. Netflix made a 4-part series about it in 2021 called This Is a Robbery, the World's Biggest Art Heist. Every few years, there's renewed media attention around the anniversary. Part of the fascination is the mystery. Who did it? Where are the paintings? Will they ever be found? It's an unsolved crime with some of the highest stakes imaginable. $500 million in art. Masterpieces by some of the greatest artists who ever lived. Empty frames hanging on walls, waiting. Part of it is also the location. This wasn't a storage facility or a private collection. This was the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, a place Isabella had designed to be a gift to Boston, a place meant to educate and inspire the public forever. The theft violated that gift. It broke the promise Isabella had made when she opened the museum in 1903. The heist also raised questions about who values art and why. The thieves clearly saw the paintings as commodities, things they could sell or trade. They cut canvases from frames without care. They damaged irreplaceable works. But those paintings meant something more than their monetary value. The Storm on the Sea of Galilee is Rembrandt's only seascape. It shows Christ and his disciples in a boat, caught in a violent storm. It's a powerful image of faith and fear. It's been studied by art historians. It's moved people who've stood in front of it. Now, it's gone. The concert by Vermeer is even more significant. Only about 34 paintings by Vermeer are known to exist. Each one is precious. The concert shows 3 people making music together in a domestic interior. It has that characteristic Vermeer light, that sense of quiet intimacy he captured better than almost anyone. It's worth hundreds of millions of dollars, yes, but it's also a window into 17th century Dutch life. It's a work of genius, and it's been missing for 35 years. The 5 Degas drawings that were stolen aren't as individually famous, but they're still significant works by one of the most important artists of the 19th century. The Monet portrait, the small Rembrandt etching, even the Chinese, bronze vessel, and the Napoleonic finial. Each piece had meaning beyond money. When the thieves walked out of the Gardner Museum that March morning, they took pieces of human cultural heritage. They took works that belonged, in a sense, to everyone. That's what makes the crime feel so personal, even to people who've never been to Boston, who've never visited the Gardner Museum. The museum has tried to move forward. They've continued their programs, their concerts, their exhibitions. They completed a major expansion in 2012, adding a new wing designed by Renzo Piano. The new building provides space for contemporary art exhibitions, educational programs, and performances. It allows the original palace building to remain largely as Isabella intended it, but those empty frames are always there. You can't walk through the Dutch room without seeing them. Visitors from around the world come to the Gardner specifically to see the empty frames, to stand where masterpieces once hung, to feel the absence. Anne Hawley, who was director during the Heist, retired in 2015. She spent a quarter-century leading the museum while living with the weight of that loss. Every year on the anniversary, she'd participate in press conferences, answer the same questions, express the same hope that the paintings might be found. The current director continues that work. Every March 18th, there are news stories, reminders, calls for anyone with information to come forward. The museum maintains a tip line. The FBI maintains its investigation, but time is running out. The people who committed the crime are almost certainly dead. The people who might have had the paintings in 1990 are dead. Each year that passes makes recovery less likely. Still, there's hope. In 2006, Austrian authorities recovered 5 Gustav Klimt paintings that had been stolen by Nazis in 1938, 68 years later. In 1990, 2 Rembrandt paintings stolen in 1983 were recovered. 7 years later, but still, art does resurface. It's Sunday, December 28, 2025. 35 years, 9 months, and 10 days since 2 men dressed as police officers walked into the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum and walked out with 13 works of art. The museum is open today like it is most days. Visitors walk through Isabella's palace, admiring her collection, experiencing the vision she spent decades creating. They move from the first floor to the second, from the Titian room to the Dutch room, following the path Isabella designed. And then they see the empty frames. Stop for a moment and imagine what Isabella Stewart Gardner would think if she could see her museum today. She created a place meant to last forever, meant to inspire and educate generations. She arranged every painting, every sculpture, every object with incredible care. She wrote a will specifically demanding that nothing ever change. And then, 66 years after she died, thieves violated her museum and stole 13 pieces she'd personally selected and placed. They cut Rembrandts from their frames. They took one of only 34 known Vermeers. They damaged irreplaceable works of art. Isabella would be heartbroken, but maybe she'd also appreciate the decision to leave the empty frames hanging, to acknowledge the loss while maintaining hope, to keep the spaces waiting for the paintings to come home. Because that's what the museum does now. It waits, the staff waits, the FBI waits, art historians wait. Everyone who cares about art and history and justice waits. The paintings might never be recovered. That's the reality. 35 years is a long time. The people most likely to have answers are dead. The trail has gone cold so many times that it might be frozen solid. But art has a way of surviving. It outlasts the criminals who steal it. It outlasts the regimes that confiscate it. It outlasts the wars that threaten it. Works that were lost for decades sometimes resurface. Paintings that were thought destroyed sometimes reappear. So the Gardner Museum keeps hoping. They keep investigating. They keep offering the $10 million reward. They keep maintaining those empty frames, waiting for the day they can be filled again. Maybe that day will come. Maybe someone will find the paintings in a basement or attic. Maybe someone with knowledge will finally come forward. Maybe a break in an unrelated case will lead investigators to the art. Or maybe the paintings are gone forever. Maybe they were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Maybe they're in a private collector's vault, never to be shown publicly again. But until there's proof they're gone, there's hope they'll return. Isabella Stewart Gardner built something remarkable. A museum that feels like a home. a collection that reflects one woman's extraordinary vision and taste. She gave it to Boston as a gift, with the specific instruction that it last forever. The heist violated that gift, it damaged that vision, but it didn't destroy it. The museum still stands. Visitors still come. The collection that remains is still extraordinary. The palace Isabella built still takes your breath away when you walk into that glass-covered courtyard, and those empty frames keep waiting. If you know something about the Gardner Museum heist, if you have information about where those 13 pieces ended up, the museum wants to hear from you. So does the FBI. There's a $10 million reward. There's the promise of confidentiality. There's the chance to return stolen masterpieces to where they belong. The museum's director of security can be reached at the Gardner Museum in Boston. The FBI has a tip line specifically for the case. Both organizations take reports seriously. Both follow every credible lead. 35 years is a long time to wait. But art is patient. Museums are patient. And the people who care about the Gardner Museum and Isabella's legacy are willing to wait as long as it takes. Because someday, maybe, those paintings will come home. Someday, those frames will be filled again. Someday, the storm on the Sea of Galilee will hang where Rembrandt's only seascape belongs. Someday, the concert will return to the Dutch room where Vermeer's masterpiece spent nearly a century. Until then, the museum waits. Boston waits. The art world waits. And every March 18th, on the anniversary of the heist, people remember. They remember what was lost. They remember what was stolen. And they remember what might someday be found. That's the story of the Gardner Museum heist, the biggest art theft in American history. 13 masterpieces stolen in 81 minutes. Billions of dollars in rewards offered. Decades of investigation. Suspects who keep dying before anyone can charge them. And empty frames that hang on museum walls waiting for paintings that might never come home, but hoping, all the same, that they will.